Paganel turned to the Patagonian and began a discourse, frequently interrupted for want of words, and from the difficulty of explaining to a half-ignorant savage details, which were rather incomprehensible to him. The geographer was just then a curious sight. He gesticulated, articulated, and exerted himself in 100 ways, while great drops of sweat rolled down his face. When his tongue could no longer move, his arm came to his aid. He dismounted and traced on the sand a geographical map, with lines of latitude and longitude, the two oceans, and the road to Carmen. Never was Professor in such embarrassment. Thalcave watched these maneuvers without showing whether he comprehended or not. The lesson in geography lasted more than half an hour. At last Paganel ceased, wiped his face, which was wet with perspiration, and looked at the Patagonian. "Did he understand?" inquired Glenarvan. "We shall see," replied Paganel, "but if he did not, I give it up." "Perhaps." Thalcave did not stir. He no longer spoke. His eyes were fixed upon the figures traced on the sand, which the wind was gradually effacing. An important road, that from Carmen to Mendoza, distinguishable by the bones of such animals as mules, horses, sheep, and oxen, whose remains were scattered by the birds of prey, and lay bleaching in the sun. "Well?" asked Paganel. Thalcave did not appear to hear him. Paganel already saw an ironical smile forming upon the lips of the major, and, wishing to save his reputation, had begun with renewed energy his geographical demonstrations, when the Patagonian stopped him with a gesture. "You are searching for a prisoner," he said. "Yes," replied Paganel. "And exactly on the line from the setting to the rising sun," said Thalcave, indicating by a comparison, in the Indian manner, the course from west to east. "Yes, yes, that is it." "And it is your God," said the Patagonian, "who has confided to the waves of the vast ocean the secrets of the prisoner." "God himself." "May his will be accomplished then," replied Thalcave with a certain solemnity. "We will go to the east, and if necessary, even to the sun." Paganel, in his exultation over his pupil, immediately translated to his companions the replies of the Indian. Glenarvan requested Paganel to ask the Patagonian if he had heard of any strangers falling into the hands of the Indians, which was accordingly done. "Perhaps," replied the Patagonian. As soon as this word was translated, Thalcave was surrounded by the 7 travelers, who gazed at him with questioning looks. Paganel, excited and scarcely finding his words, resumed these interesting interrogatories, while his eyes, fixed upon the grave Indian, strove to anticipate his reply before it issued from his lips. Every word the Patagonian said he repeated in English, so that his companions heard the Indians speak, as it were, in their own language. "And this prisoner?" inquired Paganel. "He was a stranger," replied Thalcave slowly, "a European." "You have seen him?" "No, but he is mentioned in the accounts of the Indians. He was a brave man." "You understand, my friends," said Paganel, "a courageous man." "My father," cried Robert Grant. Then, addressing Paganel, "How do you say it is my father in Spanish?" he asked. "Es mío padre," answered the geographer. Immediately Robert, taking Thalcave's hands, said in a sweet voice, "Es mío padre." "Suyo padre," replied the Patagonian, whose look brightened. He took the boy in his arms, lifted him from his horse, and gazed at him with the most curious sympathy. His intelligent countenance became suffused with a peaceful emotion. But Paganel had not finished his inquiries. Where was this prisoner? What was he doing? When had Thalcave heard of him? All these questions thronged his mind at once. He did not have to wait long for answers, but learnt that the European was a slave of one of the Indian tribes that scour the plains. "But where was he last?" asked Paganel. "With the cazique Cafocura," answered Thalcave. "On the line we have been following." "Yes." "And who is this cazique?" "The chief of the Poyaches Indians, a man with 2 tongues and 2 hearts." "A scientific bath." "That is to say, false in word and in deed," said Paganel, after translating to his companions this beautiful metaphor of the Indian language. "And can we rescue our friend?" he added. "Perhaps so, if your friend is still in the hands of the Indians." "And when did you hear of him?" "A long time ago, and since then, the sun has brought back 2 summers to the sky. Glenarvan's joy could not be described. This answer coincided exactly with the date of the document, but one question remained to be asked. "You speak of a prisoner," said Paganel, "but were there not 3? "I do not know," replied Thalcave. "And you know nothing of their actual situation?" "Nothing." This last word ended the conversation. It was possible that the 3 prisoners had been separated a long time, but the substance of the Patagonians' information was that the Indians spoke of a European who had fallen into their power. The date of his captivity, the place where he must have been, everything, even to the Patagonian phrase used to express his courage, related evidently to Captain Harry Grant. Their progress was now somewhat slow and difficult, their next object being to reach and cross the river Colorado, to which at length their horses brought them. Here Paganel's first care was to bathe, geographically, in its waters, which are colored by a reddish clay. He was surprised to find the depth so great as it really was, this being the result of the snow having melted rapidly under the first heat of summer. The width likewise of the stream was so considerable that it was almost impossible for their horses to swim across. But they happily discovered a sort of weir bridge, of wattles looped and fastened together, which the Indians were in the habit of using, and by its aid the little troop was enabled to pass over to the left bank, where they rested for the night. Chapter 17. A Serious Necessity. They set out at daybreak. The horses advanced at a brisk pace among the tufts of pajabrava, a kind of grass that serves the Indians as a shelter during the storms. At certain distances, but less and less frequent, pools of shallot water contributed to the growth of willows and a certain plant which is found in the neighborhood of fresh water. Here the horses drank their fill to fortify themselves for the journey. Thalcave, who rode in advance, beat the bushes and thus frightened away the kalinas, vipers, while the agile Thayuka bounded over all obstacles and aided his master in clearing a passage for the horses that followed. They set out at daybreak. The horses advanced at a brisk pace among the tufts of pajabrava, a kind of grass that serves the Indians as a shelter during the storms. Early in the afternoon, the first traces of animals were encountered, the bones of an innumerable drove of cattle in whitened heaps. These fragments did not extend in a winding line, such as animals exhausted and falling one by one would leave behind them. Thus no one, not even Paganel, knew how to explain this chain of skeletons in a space comparatively circumscribed. He therefore questioned Thalcave, who was not at a loss for a reply. "What is this?" they asked, after Paganel had inquired of the Indian. "The fire of heaven," replied the geographer. "What, the lightning could not have produced such a disaster," said Tom Austin, "and stretched 500 head of cattle on the earth." But Thalcave reaffirmed it, and he was not mistaken, for the storms of the Pampas are noted for their violence. At evening they stopped at an abandoned rancho, made of interlaced branches plastered with mud and covered with thatch. This structure stood within an enclosure of half-rotten stakes, which, however, sufficed to protect the horses during the night against the attacks of the foxes. Not that they had anything to fear personally from these animals, but the malicious beasts gnawed the halters, so that the horses could escape. A few paces from the rancho, a hole was dug which served as a kitchen and contained half-cooled embers. Within, there was a bench, a bed of ox hide, a saucepan, a spit, and a pot for boiling mate. The mate is a drink very much in use in South America. It is the Indian's tea, consisting of a decoction of leaves dried in the fire, and is imbibed through a straw. At Paganel's request, Thalcave prepared several cups of this beverage, which very agreeably accompanied the ordinary eatables, and was declared excellent. A change for the worse. The next day they resumed their journey towards the east. About noon, a change took place in the appearance of the Pampas, which could not escape eyes wearied with its monotony. The grass became more and more scanty, and gave place to sickly burdocks and gigantic thistles, while stunted nettles and other thorny shrubs grew here and there. Heretofore, a certain moisture preserved by the clay of the prairie freshened the meadows, the vegetation was thick and luxuriant. But now a patchy growth, bare in many places, exposed the earth and indicated the poverty of the soil. These signs of increasing dryness could not be mistaken, and Thalcave called attention to them. "I am not sorry at this change," said Tom Austin. "To see always grass, nothing but grass, becomes tiresome before long." "But where there is grass there is water," replied the Major. "Oh, we are not in want," said Wilson, and shall find some river on our course." However, when Wilson said that the supply of water would not fail, he had not calculated for the unquenchable thirst that consumed his companions all that day. And when he added that they would meet with some stream in their journey, he had anticipated too much. Indeed, not only were rivers wanting, but even the artificial wells dug by the Indians were empty. On seeing these indications of dryness increase from mile to mile, Paganel asked Thalcave where he expected to find water. "At Lake Salinas," replied the Indian. "And when shall we arrive there?" "Tomorrow evening." The natives ordinarily, when they travel on the pampas, dig wells and find water a few feet below the surface. But the travelers, destitute of the necessary implements, could not employ this expedient. It was therefore necessary to obtain a supply in some other way, for if they did not absolutely suffer from the tormenting desire for drink, no one could entirely allay his thirst. At evening they halted, after a journey of 30 miles. Every one relied upon a good night to recruit himself after the fatigues of the day, but they were greatly annoyed by a very persistent swarm of mosquitoes, which disappeared, however, after the wind changed. If the Major preserved his calmness in the midst of the petty annoyances of life, Paganel, on the contrary, could not treat the matter so indifferently. He fought the mosquitoes, and sadly regretted the absence of his acid water, which would have soothed the pain of their bites. Although the Major endeavored to console him, he awoke in a very bad humor. However, he was very easily persuaded to set out at daybreak, for it was important to arrive at Lake Salinas the same day. The horses were very much exhausted, they were dying of thirst, and although their riders had denied themselves on their account, still their share of water had been very limited. The dryness was today even greater, and the heat no less intolerable, with the dusty wind, the simoom of the pampas. Indians ahead. During the day the monotony of the journey was interrupted. Mulrady, who rode in advance, turned back, signaling the approach of a party of Indians. This meeting elicited different opinions. Glenarvan thought of the information that these natives might furnish concerning the shipwrecked seamen of the Britannia. Thalcave, for his part, scarcely enjoyed meeting in his journey the wandering Indians of the plains. He considered them plunderers and robbers, and only sought to avoid them. According to his orders, the little party collected together and made ready their firearms. It was necessary to be prepared for any emergency. The Indian detachment was soon perceived. It consisted of only 10 men, which fact reassured the Patagonian. They approached within 100 paces so that they could be easily distinguished. Their high foreheads, prominent rather than receding, their tall forms and their olive color, showed them to be magnificent types of the Indian race. They were clad in the skins of guanacos, and carried various weapons of war and the chase, while their dexterity in horsemanship was remarkable. Having halted, they appeared to hold a conference, crying and gesticulating. Glenarvan advanced toward them, but he had not proceeded 2 yards, when the detachment wheeled about and disappeared with incredible swiftness. The tired horses of the travelers could never have overtaken them. "The cowards," cried Paganel. "They fly too fast for honest men," said MacNab. "What are these Indians?" inquired Paganel of Thalcave. "Gauchos," replied the Patagonian. "Gauchos," repeated Paganel, turning toward his companions. "Gauchos. We had no need, then, to take such precautions. There was nothing to fear." "Why?" asked the Major. "Because the Gauchos are inoffensive peasants." "Do you think so, Paganel?" "Certainly, they took us for robbers and fled." Glenarvan was quite disappointed in not speaking with them, as he expected to obtain additional tidings of the lost sailors. But it was necessary to push on, if they would reach their destination that evening. At 8 o'clock Thalcave, who had gone a little in advance, announced that the lake so long desired was in sight. A quarter of an hour afterward the little party descended the high banks, but here a serious disappointment awaited them. The lake was dry. Chapter 18. In search of water. Lake Salinas terminates the cluster of lagoons that adjoin the Ventana and Guamini Mountains. Numerous expeditions are made to this place to obtain supplies of salt, with which these waters are strongly impregnated. But now the water had evaporated under the heat of the sun, and the lake was only a vast glittering basin. When Thalcave announced the presence of a drinkable liquid at Lake Salinas, he meant the streams of fresh water that flow from it in many places. but at this time, its affluents were as dry as itself. The burning sun had absorbed everything. Hence, the consternation was general when the thirsty party arrived at the parched shores of Lake Salinas. It was necessary to take counsel. The little water in the leathern bottles was half spoiled and could not quench their thirst, which began to make itself acutely felt. Hunger and fatigue gave place to this imperative want. A rauca, a kind of upright tent of leather which stood in a hollow and had been abandoned by the natives, served as a refuge for the travelers, while their horses, stretched on the muddy shores of the lake, ate the saline plants and dry reeds, although reluctantly. When each had sat down in the rauca, Paganel asked Thalcave's advice as to what was best to be done. A rapid conversation, of which Glenarvan caught a few words, ensued between the geographer and the Indian. Thalcave spoke calmly, while Paganel gesticulated for both. This consultation lasted a few minutes, and then the Patagonian folded his arms. "What did he say?" inquired Glenarvan. "I thought I understood him to advise us to separate." "Yes, into two parties," replied Paganel. "Those of us whose horses are so overcome with fatigue and thirst that they can scarcely move will continue the journey as well as possible. Those who are better mounted, on the contrary, will ride in advance and reconnoiter the Guamini River, which empties into Lake San Lucas. If there is sufficient water there, they will wait for their companions on the banks of the stream. If not, they will return to save the rest a useless journey." "And then?" asked Tom Austin. "Then we must go southward to the first branches of the Ventana Mountains, where the rivers are numerous." "The plan is good," replied Glenarvan, "and we will follow it without delay. My horse has not suffered so much yet from want of water, and I offer to accompany Thalcave." "Oh, my lord, take me," cried Robert, as if a pleasure excursion were in question. "But can you keep up with us, my child?" "Yes, I have a good beast that asks nothing better than to go in advance. Will you, my lord, I beseech you?" "Come then, my boy," said Glenarvan, delighted not to be separated from Robert. "And we three," he added, "will be very stupid if we do not discover some clear and fresh stream." "And I," said Paganel. "Oh, you, my dear Paganel," replied the major, "you will remain with the reserve detachment. You know the course, the Guamini River and the Pampas, too well to abandon us. Neither Wilson, Mulready, nor myself are capable of rejoining Thalcave at his rendezvous, unless we advance confidently under the guidance of the brave Jacques Paganel." "Poor father," exclaimed Robert, "how he will thank you when you have found him." And, so saying, he took his lordship's hand and pressed it to his lips. "I resign," said the geographer, very much flattered to obtain a higher command. "But no distractions," added the major. "Do not lead us where we have nothing to do, and bring us back to the shores of the Pacific." "You would deserve it, my intolerable major," said Paganel, smiling. "But tell me, my dear Glenarvan, how will you understand Thalcave's language?" "I suppose," answered Glenarvan, "that the Patagonian and I will not need to talk. Besides, with the few Spanish words that I know, I shall succeed well enough on an emergency in giving him my opinion and understanding his." "Go then, my worthy friend," replied Paganel. "Let us eat first," said Glenarvan, "and sleep till the hour of departure." They ate supper without drink, which was rather unrefreshing, and then fell asleep. Paganel dreamed of torrents, cascades, streams, rivers, ponds, brooks, nay, even full bottles, in short, of everything which generally contains water. It was a real nightmare. The next morning at 6 o'clock the horses were saddled. They gave them the last drink of water left, which they took with more dislike than pleasure, for it was very nauseating. The three horsemen then mounted. "Au revoir," said the Major, Austin, Wilson, and Mulready. Soon the Patagonian, Glenarvan, and Robert, not without a certain throbbing of the heart, lost sight of the detachment, confided to the sagacity of the geographer. The young sailor on horseback. Thalcave was right in first proceeding towards the Guamini, since this stream lay on the prescribed course and was the nearest. The three horses galloped briskly forward. These excellent beasts perceived, doubtless by instinct, whither their masters were guiding them. Thaouka, especially, showed a spirit that neither fatigue nor thirst could overcome. The other horses followed, at a slower pace, but incited by his example. The Patagonian frequently turned his head to look at Robert Grant, and, seeing the young boy firm and erect, in an easy and graceful position, testified his satisfaction by a word of encouragement. "Bravo, Robert," said Glenarvan. "Thalcave seems to congratulate you. He praises you, my boy." "And why, my lord?" "Because of the way you ride." "Oh, I merely keep firm. That is all," replied Robert, who blushed with pleasure at hearing himself complimented. "That is the main point, Robert," said Glenarvan. "But you are too modest, and I am sure you cannot fail to become an accomplished equestrian." "Well," said Robert, "but what will Papa say, who wishes to make a sailor of me?" "The one does not interfere with the other. If all horsemen do not make good sailors, all sailors may certainly make good horsemen. To ride on the yards, you must learn to keep yourself firm. As for knowing how to manage your horse, that comes more easily." "Poor father," exclaimed Robert, "how he will thank you when you have found him." And, so saying, he took his lordship's hand and pressed it to his lips. "You love him well, Robert?" "Yes, my lord, he was so kind to sister and me. He thought only of us, and every voyage brought us a memento of the countries he visited, and what was better, tender caresses and kind words on his return. Ah, you will love him too when you know him. Mary resembles him. He has a sweet voice like her. It is singular for a sailor, is it not?" "Yes, very singular, Robert," said Glenarvan. "I see him still," replied the boy, as if speaking to himself. "Good and brave papa. He rocked me to sleep on his knees when I was little, and kept humming an old Scottish song which is sung around the lakes of our country. I sometimes recall the air, but indistinctly. How we loved him, my lord! Well, I think one must be very young to love his father well." "And old to reverence him, my child," replied Glenarvan, quite moved by the words that came from this young heart. During this conversation, their horses had relaxed their pace and fallen behind the other, but Thalcave called them, and they resumed their former gait. It was soon evident, however, that, with the exception of Thayuka, the horses could not long maintain this speed. At noon it was necessary to give them an hour's rest. Glenarvan grew uneasy. The signs of dryness did not diminish, and the want of water might result in disastrous consequences. Thalcave said nothing, but probably thought that if the Guamini was dry, it would then be time to despair, if indeed an Indian's heart has ever experienced such an emotion. They therefore kept on, and by use of whip and spur the horses were induced to continue their journey, but they could not quicken their pace. Thalcave might easily have gone ahead, for in a few hours Thayuka could have carried him to the banks of the stream. He doubtless thought of it, but probably did not like to leave his two companions alone in the midst of this desert, and that he might not outstrip them, he forced Thayuka to lessen his speed. It was not, however, without much resistance, prancing and neighing, that Thalcave's horse consented to keep pace with the others. It was not so much the strength as the voice of his master which restrained him. The Indian actually talked to his horse, and the animal, if he did not answer, at least comprehended him. The Patagonian must have used excellent arguments, for, after discussing some time, Thayuka yielded, and obeyed his master's commands. Gained at last. But if Thayuka understood Thalcave, Thalcave had none the less understood Thayuka. The intelligent animal, through his superior instincts, had perceived a moisture in the air. He inhaled it eagerly, and kept moving his tongue, as if it were steeped in a grateful liquid. The Patagonian could not be deceived. Water was not far distant. He therefore encouraged his companions by explaining the impatience of his horse, which the others were not long in understanding. They made a final effort, and galloped after the Indian. About 3 o'clock, a bright line appeared in a hollow of the plain. It trembled under the rays of the sun. "Water!" cried Glenarvan. "Water, yes, water!" cried Robert. They had no more need to urge their horses. The poor beasts, feeling their strength renewed, rushed forward with an irresistible eagerness. In a few moments they had reached the Guamini River, and saddled as they were, plunged to their breasts into the cooling stream. Their masters imitated their example, without reluctance, and took an afternoon bath which was as healthful as it was pleasant. "Ah, how good it is," said Robert, as he quenched his thirst in the middle of the river. "Be moderate, my boy," said Glenarvan, who did not set a good example. Nothing was heard but the sound of rapid drinking. As for Thalcave, he drank quietly, without hurrying, long and deeply, till they might perhaps fear that the stream would be drained. "Well," said Glenarvan, "our friends will not be disappointed in their expectations. They are sure, on arriving at the Guamini, to find an abundance of clear water, if Thalcave leaves any." "But could we not go to meet them?" asked Robert. "We could spare them several hours of anxiety." "Doubtless, my boy, but how carry the water? Wilson has charge of the water bottles. No, it is better to wait, as we agreed. Calculating the necessary time and the slow pace of the horses, our friends will be here at night. Let us, then, prepare them a safe shelter and a good repast." Thalcave had not waited for Glenarvan's orders to search for a place to encamp. He had very fortunately found on the banks of the river a ramada, a kind of enclosure designed for a cattle fold and shut in on three sides. The situation was excellent for the purpose, so long as one did not fear to sleep in the open air, and that was the least anxiety of Thalcave's companions. Thus they did not seek a better retreat, but stretched themselves on the ground in the sun to dry their water-soaked garments. "Well, since here is shelter," said Glenarvan, "let us think of supper. Our friends must be satisfied with the couriers whom they have sent forward, and if I am not greatly mistaken, they will have no reason to complain. I think an hour's hunting will not be time lost. Are you ready, Robert?" "Yes, my lord," replied he with gun in hand. An evening's sport. Glenarvan had conceived this idea, because the banks of the Guamini seemed to be the haunt of the game of the surrounding plains. Tinamous, a kind of partridge, plovers called teru-teru, yellow rails, and waterfowl of magnificent green were seen rising in flocks. As for quadrupeds, they did not make their appearance, but Thalcave, pointing to the tall grass and thick coppice, explained that they were hidden there. The hunters had only to take a few steps to find themselves in one of the best game coverts in the world. They began to hunt, therefore, and disdaining the feathered tribe, their first attempts were made upon the large game of the pampas. Soon hares and guanacos, like those that had attacked them so violently on the Andes, started up before them by hundreds. But these very timid animals fled with such swiftness that it was impossible to come within gunshot. The hunters, therefore, attacked other game that was less fleet. A dozen partridges and rails were brought down, and Glenarvan shot a peccary, which was very good eating. In less than half an hour they had obtained without difficulty all the game they needed. Robert captured a curious animal called an armadillo, which was covered with a sort of helmet of movable bony pieces and measured 1.5 feet in length. It was very fat, and would be an excellent dish, as the Patagonians said, while Robert was proud of his success. As for Thalcave, he showed his companions a nandu hunt. This bird, peculiar to the pampas, is a kind of ostrich, whose swiftness is marvelous. The Indian did not try to decoy so nimble an animal, but urged his horse to a gallop, straight towards the bird, so as to overtake it at once. For, if the first attack should fail, the nandu would soon fatigue both horse and rider with its giddy backward and forward movements. Thalcave, arriving at a proper distance, launched his boluses with a strong hand, and so skillfully that they twisted about the legs of the ostrich and paralyzed its efforts. In a few moments it lay on the ground. The Indians soon captured his prize and contributed it to the common repast. The string of partridges, Thalcave's ostrich, Glenarvan's peccary, and Robert's armadillo were brought back to camp. The ostrich and the peccary were immediately stripped of their skin and cut into small slices. As for the armadillo, it is a dainty animal which carries its roasting dish with it, and it was, accordingly, placed in its own bony covering on the glowing embers. The three hunters were satisfied with the partridges for supper, and kept the rounds of beef for their friends. This repast was washed down with clear water, which was then considered superior to all the wines in the world. The horses were not forgot. A great quantity of dry fodder, piled in the ramada, served them for food and bedding. Desert silence. When everything was ready, Glenarvan, Robert, and the Indian wrapped themselves in their ponchos, and stretched their limbs on a bundle of alfafairs, the usual bed of the hunters of the pampas. Chapter 19. The Red Wolves. Night came, the night of the new moon. Only the uncertain light of the stars illumined the plain. On the horizon the zodiacal light faded away in a dark mist. The waters of the Guamini flowed without a murmur, while birds, quadrupeds, and reptiles reposed after the fatigues of the day. The silence of the desert reigned on the vast expanse of the pampas. Glenarvan, Robert, and Thalcave had yielded to the common law, and stretched on their thick beds of grass, they enjoyed a refreshing sleep. The horses, overcome with fatigue, had lain down on the ground. Thayuka alone, like a true-blooded horse, slept standing, spirited in repose as in action, and ready to start at the least sign from his master. Perfect tranquility reigned within the enclosure, and the embers of the night fire, as they gradually died out, cast their last rays over the silent obscurity. About 10 o'clock, after a short sleep, the Indian awoke. His eyes became fixed beneath his lowered eyebrows, and his head was turned in a listening attitude towards the plain. He seemed endeavoring to detect some scarcely perceptible sound. A vague uneasiness was soon expressed on his face, usually so calm. Had he perceived the approach of prowling Indians, or the coming of jaguars, water tigers, and other formidable beasts which are numerous in the neighborhood of rivers? This last possibility doubtless appeared plausible to him, for he cast a rapid glance over the combustible materials piled in the enclosure, and his anxiety increased. In fact, all this dry bedding would quickly be consumed, and could not long intimidate the audacious animals. According to this conjecture, Thalcave had only to await the progress of events, which he did, half reclining, his head resting on his hands, his elbows on his knees, his eyes motionless, in the attitude of a man whom a sudden anxiety has awakened from sleep. An hour passed. Any other person but Thalcave, reassured by the outward silence, would have lain down again. But where a stranger would have suspected nothing, the highly trained senses and natural instinct of the Indian foresaw the coming danger. While he was listening and watching, Thalcave gave a low neigh. His nose was stretched towards the entrance to the ramada. The Patagonian suddenly started. "Thalcave has scented some enemy," said he. He arose and scanned the plain attentively. Silence still reigned, but not tranquility. Thalcave discerned shadows moving noiselessly among the tufts of grass. Here and there glittered luminous points, which spread on all sides, now fading away and now gleaming forth again. You would have thought fantastic elves were dancing on the surface of an immense lagoon. A stranger would doubtless have taken these flitting sparks for glowworms, which shine, when night comes, in many parts of the pampas. But Thalcave was not deceived. He knew with what enemies he had to deal. He loaded his carbine, and took a position near the first stakes of the enclosure. He did not wait long. A strange cry, a mingling of barks and howls, resounded over the plain. The report of the carbine answered it, and was followed by 100 frightful yelps. Glenarvan and Robert suddenly awoke. Fearful odds! "What is the matter?" asked Robert. "Indians," said Glenarvan. "No," replied Thalcave, "agaras." Robert looked at Glenarvan. "Agaras," said he. "Yes," replied Glenarvan, "the red wolves of the pampas." Both seized their weapons, and joined the Indian. The latter pointed to the plain, from which arose a series of formidable howls. Robert involuntarily took a step backward. "You are not afraid of the wolves, my boy," said Glenarvan. "No, my lord," replied Robert in a firm tone. "With you I fear nothing." "So much the better. These agaras are not very formidable beasts, and were it not for their numbers I should not even think of them." "What does it matter?" replied Robert. "We are well armed, let them come. And they shall be well received." Speaking thus, Glenarvan endeavored to reassure the lad, but he did not think without a secret terror of that dense horde of exasperated beasts. Perhaps there were hundreds of them, and these three, however well armed, could not advantageously contend against so many and such antagonists. By the howls that resounded over the pampas, and by the multitude of shadows that flitted about the plain, Glenarvan could not be mistaken as to the number. These animals had scented a sure prey, horseflesh or human flesh, and not one among them would return to his lair without having his portion. The situation was, therefore, very alarming. Meanwhile the circle of wolves grew gradually narrower. The horses, awakened, gave signs of the liveliest terror. Thalcave alone pawed the ground, seeking to break his halter, and ready to rush out. His master succeeded in calming him only by whistling continually. Glenarvan and Robert had stationed themselves so as to defend the entrance of the ramada, and with their loaded rifles were about to fire at the first ranks of wolves, when Thalcave turned aside their weapons already poised for a shot. "What does Thalcave wish?" asked Robert. "He prohibits us from firing," answered Glenarvan. "Why?" "Perhaps he does not consider it the proper time." This was not, however, the motive which actuated the Indian, but a graver reason, which Glenarvan understood when Thalcave, raising his powder flask and inverting it, showed that it was almost empty. "Well," said Robert, We must economize our ammunition. Our hunt today has cost us dear, and we are deficient in powder and shot. We have not 20 charges left." The boy answered nothing. "You are not afraid, Robert?" "No, my lord." "Very well, my boy." At this moment, another report resounded. Thalcave had brought down a too bold enemy. The wolves that were advancing in close ranks recoiled and gathered together again 100 paces from the enclosure. The last hour. Glenarvan, at a sign from the Indian, took his place at once, while the latter, collecting the bedding, grass, and all combustible materials, piled them at the entrance of the ramada and threw on a burning ember. Soon a curtain of flame was defined against the dark background of the sky, and through the openings the plain appeared illumined by great moving reflections. Glenarvan could therefore judge of the great number of animals against which they had to defend themselves. Never had so many wolves been seen together before, nor so excited by rapacity. The fiery barrier that Thalcave had just opposed to them had redoubled their fury. Some, however, advanced to the very fire, crowded by the rear ranks, and burned their paws. From time to time, a shot was necessary to check the howling horde, and at the end of an hour 15 bodies lay on the prairie. The besieged were now in a situation relatively less dangerous. So long as their supplies lasted, so long as the barrier of fire stood at the entrance to the ramada, invasion was not to be feared. But what was to be done if all these methods of repelling the wolves should fail at the same time? Glenarvan gazed at Robert and felt his heart beat quick with excitement. He forgot himself and thought only of this poor child, who displayed a courage beyond his years. Robert was pale, but his hand did not leave his weapon, and he awaited with firm bearing the assault of the enraged wolves. Meantime, Glenarvan, after coolly considering the situation, resolved to do something decisive. "In 1 hour," said he, "we shall have no more powder, shot, or fire. We must not wait till then to make a sally." He turned towards Thalcave, and, recalling a few words of Spanish, began a conversation with the Indian, frequently interrupted by the cracks of the rifle. It was not without difficulty that these two men succeeded in understanding each other. Glenarvan, fortunately, knew the habits of the red wolf. Without this knowledge, he could not have interpreted the words and gestures of the Patagonian. Nevertheless, a quarter of an hour passed before he could give to Robert the meaning of Thalcave's answer. He had questioned the Indian concerning their situation. "And what did he answer?" inquired Robert. "He said that, cost what it may, we must hold out till daybreak. The Agara goes out only at night, and when morning comes he returns to his lair. He is the wolf of darkness, a cowardly beast that fears the daylight." "Well, let us defend ourselves till day." "Yes, my boy, and with our knives if we can no longer use our guns." Already Thalcave had set the example, and when a wolf approached the fire, the long knife of the Patagonian was thrust through the flames and drawn back again red with blood. However, the means of defense were failing. About 2 o'clock in the morning, Thalcave threw into the fire the last armful of fuel, and the besieged had only 5 charges left. Glenarvan cast about him a sorrowful glance. He thought of the child who was there, of his companions, of all whom he loved. Robert said nothing. Perhaps the danger did not appear imminent to his hopeful spirit. But Glenarvan pictured to himself that terrible event, now apparently inevitable, the being devoured alive. He was not master of his emotion. He drew the child to his breast, he clasped him to his heart, he pressed his lips to his forehead, while tears flowed from his eyes. Robert gazed at him with a smile. "I am not afraid," said he. "No, my boy, no," replied Glenarvan. "And you are right. In 2 hours day will appear, and we shall be saved. Well done, Thalcave, my brave Patagonian," cried he, as the Indian killed with the butt of his gun 2 enormous beasts that were attempting to cross the glowing barrier. A dying hope. But at this moment the dying light of the fire showed him the Agaras advancing in a dense body to assail the ramada. The denouement of the bloody drama was approaching. The fire gradually subsided for want of fuel, the flames sank. The plain, before illumined, now relapsed into shadow, and in the shadow reappeared the terrible eyes of the red wolves. A few moments more, and the whole drove would rush into the enclosure. Thalcave discharged his carbine for the last time, stretched out one more of their enemies, and as his ammunition was exhausted, folded his arms. His head sank upon his breast. He appeared to be questioning himself. Was he searching for some bold, novel, or rash scheme for repelling this furious herd? Glenarvan did not venture to ask him. At this moment, a change took place in the action of the wolves. They seemed to be retreating, and their howls, so deafening before, suddenly ceased. An ominous silence reigned over the plain. "They are going," said Robert. "Perhaps," replied Glenarvan, who was listening with intentness. But Thalcave shook his head. He knew well that the animals would not abandon a certain prey until at daybreak they returned to their holes and dens. However, the tactics of their enemies had evidently changed. They no longer endeavored to force the entrance of the Ramada, but their new maneuvers were already causing a still more imminent danger. The wolves, abandoning their design of penetrating the enclosure by this entrance, which was defended by weapon and fire, went to the back of the Ramada and sought to assail it in the rear. Their claws were soon heard rattling against the half-decayed wood. Already their powerful paws and bloody mouths had forced their way between the shattered stakes. The horses, bewildered and panic-stricken, broke their halters and dashed into the enclosure. Glenarvan seized Robert in his arms to defend him to the last extremity, and he would have attempted a rash flight and rushed out of the Ramada had not his eyes fallen upon the Indian. Thalcave, turning like a deer, had suddenly approached his horse, which was neighing with impatience, and was beginning to saddle him carefully, forgetting neither strap nor buckle. He seemed no longer to care for the howls, that were now redoubled. Glenarvan gazed at him with a dark foreboding. "He is leaving us," cried he, seeing Thalcave gather up his reins as though he were about to mount. "He never," said Robert. In truth, the Indian was about to make a venture, not to leave his friends, but to save them by sacrificing himself. Thaouka was ready. He champed his bit, he pranced. His eyes, full of a fiery spirit, shot forth lightning flashes. He understood his master. Just as the Indian was seizing the mane of his horse, Glenarvan caught him by the arm with a convulsive grasp. "You are going," said he, pointing to the plain, which was now deserted. "Yes," replied the Indian, who comprehended the gesture of his companion, and with vehement gesticulations which were however perfectly intelligible, he added a few words in Spanish which signified, "Thaouka, good horse, swift, will draw the wolves after him." Frightful howls resounded. The wolves, starting on the track of the horse, fled into the darkness with a terrible speed. "Ha, Thalcave," cried Glenarvan. "Quick, quick," continued the Indian, while Glenarvan said to Robert in a voice broken by emotion, "Robert, my lad, you hear. He will sacrifice himself for us. He will rush out over the plain and turn aside the fury of the wolves upon himself." "Friend Thalcave," replied Robert, looking imploringly at the Patagonian, "Friend Thalcave, do not leave us." "No," said Glenarvan, "he will not leave us." And turning to the Indian, he added, pointing to the terrified horses crowding against the stakes, "Let us go together." "No," said the Indian, who was not mistaken as to the meaning of these words. "Bad beasts, frightened Thaouka, good horse." "Very well," said Glenarvan. "Thalcave shall not leave Robert. He shows me what I have to do. It is my duty to go and his to remain with you." Then seizing Thaouka's bridle, he added, "I will go." "No," replied the Patagonian calmly. "I tell you," cried Glenarvan, taking the bridle from the hands of the Indian, "I will go. Save this boy, I trust him to you, Thalcave." Glenarvan, in his excitement, mingled English and Spanish together. But what matters the language? In such a terrible situation, signs tell all, and men quickly understand each other. Safety for two. However, Thalcave resisted, and the discussion was prolonged. The danger was increasing every moment. Already the broken stakes were yielding to the teeth and claws of the wolves, but neither Glenarvan nor Thalcave appeared willing to yield. The Indian had drawn Glenarvan towards the entrance of the enclosure. He pointed to the plain, now free from wolves. In his animated language, he explained that not a moment was to be lost, that the danger, if this plan failed, would be greater for those who remained. In short, that he alone knew Thaouka well enough to employ his marvelous agility and speed for the common safety. Glenarvan blindly persisted in his resolve to sacrifice himself, when suddenly he was pushed violently back. Thaouka pranced, reared on his hind legs, and all at once, with a spring, cleared the barrier of fire and the rampart of bodies, while a boyish voice cried, "God save you, my lord!" Glenarvan and Thalcave had scarcely time to perceive Robert, who, clinging to the horse's mane, disappeared in the darkness. "Robert, unfortunate!" cried Glenarvan. But these words the Indian himself could not hear. Frightful howls resounded. The wolves, starting on the track of the horse, fled into the darkness with a terrible speed. Thalcave and Glenarvan rushed out of the ramada. Already the plain had resumed its tranquility, and they could scarcely distinguish a moving line which undulated afar in the shadows of the night. Glenarvan sank upon the ground, overcome in despair, clasping his hands. He gazed at Thalcave, who smiled with his accustomed calmness. "Thayuka, good horse, brave child, he will be saved," he repeated, nodding his head. "But if he falls," said Glenarvan. "He will not fall." In spite of Thalcave's confidence, his companion passed the night in terrible anguish. He was no longer even mindful of the danger still to be feared from the wolves. He would have gone in search of Robert, but the Indian restrained him and explained that their horses could not overtake the boy, that Thayuka must have distanced his enemies and could not be found in the darkness. They must wait for day to start in search of Robert. At 4 o'clock in the morning, day began to break. The mists of the horizon were soon tinged with pale rays. A sparkling dew covered the plain, and the tall grass began to wave under the first breezes of the dawn. The moment of departure had arrived. "Forward," said the Indian.